On the morning of August 12, 2014, a receptionist at the St. Regis Bali Resort noticed something unusual during a routine checkout. A young woman and her male companion were leaving 3 days earlier than scheduled, their luggage heavier than it should have been, and a third guest listed on the reservation was nowhere to be seen. What began as a procedural security check would unravel a crime so calculated, so deeply rooted in years of family fracture, that investigators across 2 continents would spend months piecing together how a mother-daughter vacation to paradise became the setting for one of the most disturbing acts of betrayal in modern true crime. This is the story of Rebecca Cooper, a successful businesswoman who wanted nothing more than to repair her relationship with her only child. It is also the story of Nancy Cooper, a young woman whose resentment had festered for so long that reconciliation was no longer an option she could imagine. And it is the story of how love, when twisted by anger and manipulation, can turn into something unrecognizable. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Rebecca Marie Cooper was born on March 14, 1972, in Portland, Oregon, the youngest of 3 children in a middle-class family that valued education and hard work above almost everything else. Her father, David Cooper, was a civil engineer who had worked his way up from a drafting position to senior project manager at a regional infrastructure firm. Her mother, Linda Cooper, taught high school English and was known in the community as someone who pushed her students to think critically and write with precision. The Cooper household was structured, predictable, and achievement-oriented. David brought home blueprints and explained load-bearing calculations at the dinner table. Linda corrected grammar in casual conversation and assigned her own children book reports during summer vacations. Rebecca's 2 older brothers, Michael and Daniel, both excelled academically, with Michael going on to study engineering like their father and Daniel pursuing medicine. Rebecca, the youngest by 6 years, grew up watching her brothers set high standards and felt the unspoken expectation that she would do the same. She excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and debate, subjects that rewarded logical thinking and the ability to construct persuasive arguments. Her high school debate coach, Mr. Thomas Reinhardt, later recalled that Rebecca had an unusual combination of analytical precision and competitive drive. She didn't just want to win debates. She wanted to dismantle opposing arguments so thoroughly that there was no room for rebuttal. She competed at the state level twice, placing second her junior year and first her senior year. College was never a question, only a matter of where. Rebecca was accepted to several universities, but chose the University of Oregon in Eugene, partly because it offered a strong business program, and partly because it was close enough to home that she could visit family when needed, but far enough that she could establish her own identity. She declared a major in business administration with a minor in economics and threw herself into her coursework with the same intensity she had brought to high school debate. Her professors noticed her immediately. She asked sharp questions in lectures, stayed after class to discuss case studies, and was often the first to volunteer for group presentations. But she was also seen as somewhat distant by her peers, someone who was pleasant enough but difficult to know on a personal level. She studied more than she socialized, attended networking events more than parties, and by her junior year had secured an internship at a regional investment firm called Pacific Northwest Capital Management. It was during her senior year, at a networking event hosted by the business school, that Rebecca met Andrew Michael Cooper. The coincidence of their shared last name became an easy conversation starter, though they were not related. Andrew was quieter than Rebecca, more introspective, studying psychology with plans to become a school counselor or therapist. He had grown up in a small town outside Eugene, the son of a school teacher and a carpenter, and his approach to life was less about achievement and more about understanding people and helping them navigate difficult emotions. Friends who knew them both during college said they seemed like an unlikely pair at first. Rebecca was always moving, always planning the next step in her career, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Andrew moved at a slower pace, asked more questions, listened more than he spoke. But the differences seemed to balance them well. Rebecca appreciated that Andrew didn't try to compete with her or challenge her ambitions. Andrew appreciated that Rebecca had direction and confidence, qualities he felt he sometimes lacked. They began dating in the spring of 1994, and by the time they graduated in 1995, they had decided to marry. The wedding took place in September of that year, a small ceremony attended by close family and friends at a community center in Eugene. Rebecca wore a simple white dress she had purchased off the rack. Andrew wore a suit borrowed from his older brother. The reception featured homemade food and a playlist of folk and classic rock songs that Andrew had spent weeks curating. It was modest, unpretentious, and reflective of who they both were at the time. For the first few years of their marriage, things went smoothly. Rebecca secured a position as a junior analyst at Pacific Northwest Capital Management, the same firm where she had interned, and began climbing steadily through the ranks. Her work involved analyzing investment portfolios, advising clients on asset allocation, and presenting quarterly reports to senior management. She was good at it, and her supervisors recognized that quickly. By 1997, she had been promoted to Associate Portfolio Manager, a position that came with longer hours and more responsibility, but also a significant increase in salary. Andrew, meanwhile, found work as a counselor at a middle school in Eugene, a job that allowed him flexible hours and the emotional bandwidth to support Rebecca's demanding career. He enjoyed working with students, particularly those who were struggling with family issues or social anxiety, and he was known among colleagues as patient, empathetic, and good at building trust with kids who didn't open up easily. When Rebecca became pregnant in late 1998, both of them were thrilled, though the timing was not ideal from a career perspective. Rebecca was in the middle of a major project at work, managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio for a high-profile client, and the idea of taking extended leave made her anxious. She negotiated with her employer to work part-time from home during the final months of her pregnancy and to return to full-time work as soon as she was physically able. Andrew, understanding Rebecca's concerns about her career trajectory, agreed to take on more of the childcare responsibilities once the baby arrived. Nancy Elizabeth Cooper was born on May 3, 1999, at Sacred Heart Medical Center in Eugene. The delivery was uncomplicated, and both mother and daughter were healthy. Rebecca took 6 weeks of maternity leave, during which she worked remotely as much as possible, answering emails late at night and participating in conference calls during Nancy's naps. Andrew noticed the strain this put on Rebecca, but didn't push back, believing that she knew what she needed to do to feel secure in her career. When Rebecca returned to the office full-time in mid-June, Andrew adjusted his work schedule to be home more often. He took Nancy to pediatrician appointments, handled the majority of nighttime feedings, and arranged his counseling sessions at school so that he could leave early most afternoons. This arrangement worked logistically, but it set a pattern that would define Nancy's childhood. Andrew became the primary caregiver, the parent Nancy turned to for comfort and attention. Rebecca became the provider, the parent who ensured financial stability, but was often absent during the day-to-day moments that build intimacy between parent and child. By the time Nancy was in preschool, this dynamic was firmly established. Andrew was the one who dropped her off and picked her up, who knew the names of her teachers and classmates, who attended school events and volunteered for field trips. Rebecca attended when her schedule allowed, but her schedule rarely allowed. Colleagues at Pacific Northwest Capital Management later told investigators that Rebecca was often the first to arrive at the office and the last to leave, that she traveled frequently for client meetings, and that she rarely spoke about her family during work hours. She was professional, focused, and exceptionally good at her job, but she compartmentalized in a way that left little room for personal life to intrude on professional responsibilities. Nancy, as she grew older, began to internalize this dynamic. She adored her father, who was always available, always present, always ready to listen. She felt ambivalent about her mother, who was often gone and who, when she was home, seemed preoccupied with work or too tired to engage fully. This ambivalence would gradually shift toward resentment as Nancy entered adolescence and began to interpret her mother's absence not as a sacrifice made for the family's benefit, but as evidence that her mother didn't care enough to prioritize her. By the time Nancy entered middle school in 2011, the Cooper family was showing signs of strain. Rebecca had been promoted again, this time to senior portfolio manager, a position that required even more travel and longer hours. Andrew, meanwhile, had grown increasingly frustrated with the imbalance in their marriage. He felt that he was carrying the emotional weight of the household alone, that Rebecca's career had become the central organizing principle of their lives, and that his own needs and contributions were undervalued. They argued more frequently, often about small things: who had forgotten to pick up groceries, who had missed a parent-teacher conference. But the arguments were really about larger issues neither of them knew how to address directly. Nancy, now 12 years old, was old enough to understand that her parents were unhappy, but not old enough to understand why. She heard them arguing through closed doors, saw the tension in the way they interacted at the dinner table, and felt the unspoken pressure to choose sides. She chose her father, the parent who had always been there, the parent who seemed to understand her in ways her mother never had. Rebecca noticed the shift, but didn't know how to reverse it. She tried spending more time with Nancy on weekends, planning mother-daughter outings to the movies or the mall, but these efforts felt forced and often ended in frustration. Nancy was monosyllabic, uninterested, eager to get back to her phone or her friends. Rebecca, for her part, found it difficult to connect with a daughter whose interests and concerns felt foreign to her. She didn't understand Nancy's fascination with social media, didn't know the names of the YouTubers or musicians Nancy talked about, and didn't have the patience for the emotional volatility that came with adolescence. She responded to Nancy's moodiness with rules and consequences, grounding her when she broke curfew, taking away privileges when her grades slipped, enforcing structure because structure was what Rebecca understood. But structure without relationship felt like control to Nancy, and control felt like proof that her mother didn't really know her or care to. The divorce, when it came in early 2014, was not sudden, but it was still devastating. Andrew and Rebecca had been seeing a marriage counselor for 6 months, trying to salvage what was left of their relationship, but the sessions only seemed to clarify how far apart they had grown. Andrew felt emotionally neglected, unappreciated, and exhausted from years of shouldering the household responsibilities alone. Rebecca felt that she had been doing what was necessary to provide for the family, that her sacrifices were being dismissed, and that Andrew was unwilling to acknowledge the financial security she had created. The counselor suggested a trial separation, and Andrew moved into an apartment across town in February 2014. Nancy, now 15, was blindsided. She hadn't realized the marriage was in such serious trouble, and the news that her father was leaving felt like abandonment, even though Andrew assured her he was still available and wanted to see her as often as possible. Nancy blamed Rebecca almost entirely. In her mind, it was her mother's obsession with work that had driven her father away, her mother's inability to be emotionally present that had destroyed the family. She stopped speaking to Rebecca, except when necessary, refused to engage in family therapy sessions that Rebecca tried to arrange, and spent as much time as possible at her father's apartment, where she felt understood and safe. Rebecca, heartbroken and desperate, tried everything she could think of to repair the relationship. She cut back her hours at work, arranged her schedule to be home for dinner more often, attended Nancy's school events even when it meant rescheduling important meetings. But every effort was met with resistance or indifference. Nancy had built a wall between them, and Rebecca couldn't find a way through. It was during this period, in the spring of 2014, that Nancy met Ryan Michael Jackson, known to most people as Ray. Ray was 17, 2 years older than Nancy, and had dropped out of high school the previous year. He came from a troubled background, the youngest of 4 children in a family marked by instability and financial hardship. His father had been in and out of prison for drug-related offenses, and his mother worked multiple jobs to support the family, leaving Ray and his siblings to fend for themselves much of the time. Ray had been arrested twice as a juvenile, once for shoplifting and once for vandalism, and had spent 3 months in a juvenile detention facility when he was 16. He worked sporadically in construction, doing day labor when he could find it, but he had no stable employment and no clear sense of direction. He was charismatic in a rough-edged way, confident, streetwise, and willing to take risks that more cautious people avoided. Nancy met him through a mutual friend at a party in late March, and they began spending time together almost immediately. To Nancy, Ray represented freedom. He didn't judge her, didn't impose rules, didn't expect her to be anything other than what she was. He listened to her complaints about her mother, validated her anger, and made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. To Ray, Nancy was something else entirely. She was younger, more naive, and came from a world of relative privilege that he had never experienced. She had access to money, even if she had to steal it, and she was willing to do things that other girls her age would have refused. He recognized early on that Nancy could be useful to him, and he cultivated the relationship with that in mind. Rebecca met Ray once briefly, in early April when she came home unexpectedly, and found him in the living room with Nancy. The encounter lasted less than 5 minutes, but it was enough for Rebecca to form a strong opinion. She didn't like the way Ray carried himself, the way he avoided making eye contact, the way he seemed simultaneously deferential and vaguely threatening. After he left, Rebecca confronted Nancy, telling her she didn't think Ray was a good influence and asking her to stop seeing him. Nancy's response was explosive. She accused Rebecca of being judgmental, controlling, and unable to accept that Nancy was old enough to make her own decisions. She told her mother that Ray was the only person who actually understood her, that Rebecca had no right to interfere, and that if she tried to keep them apart, it would only make Nancy want to see him more. Rebecca, shaken by the intensity of Nancy's reaction, backed down, but made a mental note to keep a closer eye on the relationship. Over the following weeks, Nancy and Ray grew closer, and the relationship took on a darker tone. Ray began encouraging Nancy to distance herself from her family, telling her that her mother was toxic and that the only way she would ever be free was to cut ties completely. He talked about running away together, starting over somewhere new, leaving behind the people and places that had caused them both pain. Nancy, caught up in the intensity of young love and eager to escape the suffocating tension at home, began to take these ideas seriously. She started stealing small amounts of money from her mother's purse and credit cards, telling herself it was justified because her mother owed her for all the years of neglect. She lied about where she was going and who she was with, spending nights at Ray's apartment and telling her mother she was staying with friends. Rebecca, overwhelmed by work and unsure how to regain control, set boundaries but struggled to enforce them. She grounded Nancy multiple times, only to have Nancy sneak out anyway. She tried to involve Andrew, but Andrew, though concerned, was reluctant to impose strict discipline, believing that Nancy needed support and understanding more than punishment. The situation escalated throughout the spring, and by early summer, Rebecca felt she was losing her daughter entirely. In a desperate attempt to salvage the relationship, Rebecca proposed a vacation. She had read articles about the importance of quality time in rebuilding fractured family bonds, and she thought that getting away from the daily pressures of life in Eugene might give them a chance to reconnect. She suggested Bali, a destination she had visited once on a business trip and found beautiful and peaceful. The trip would be just the two of them, a week in paradise with no distractions, no arguments about Ray, no reminders of the divorce. Nancy, surprisingly, agreed. Rebecca assumed this was a sign that Nancy wanted to repair things too, that beneath the anger and defiance there was still a part of her daughter who missed having a close relationship with her mother. What Rebecca didn't know was that Nancy had already been planning something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with reconciliation. Nancy had been discussing the trip with Ray for weeks before Rebecca officially proposed it. Text messages later recovered by investigators showed that Nancy had been the one to suggest, Bali planting the idea in her mother's mind by mentioning casually that she had always wanted to go there, that it seemed like a beautiful place, that it might be nice to get away for a while. Rebecca, eager for any sign that Nancy was willing to spend time with her, had taken the bait. Once the trip was booked, Nancy and Ray began making their own plans. Nancy used her mother's credit card to book Ray a room at a budget hotel in Nusa Dua, the same area where the St. Regis was located, charging small amounts over several weeks to avoid raising suspicion. She purchased Ray's plane ticket using a combination of stolen money and a prepaid debit card she had obtained using false information. She researched the layout of the St. Regis, looking at floor plans and guest reviews to understand the security measures in place, and she maintained constant communication with Ray, coordinating every detail of what they were planning to do once they arrived in Bali. The messages between them during this period were chilling in their casual tone. On July 15th, 3 weeks before the scheduled departure, Nancy sent Ray a message that read, "I looked at the hotel. Security's not that tight. We can make this work." Ray responded, "You sure you want to go through with this?" Nancy's reply came quickly, "I'm sure. She's never going to change. This is the only way." The messages continued over the following weeks, with Nancy providing updates on the travel arrangements and Ray expressing occasional doubts that Nancy quickly dismissed. On July 28th, a week before departure, Nancy sent Ray a message that read, "Once we're there, we'll have our chance. No one will know." Ray's response was brief, "I'm ready." The flight to Bali was booked for August 4th, with a layover in Tokyo. Rebecca used the long travel time to try to initiate conversations with Nancy, asking about school, about her plans for the following year, about anything that might get her daughter to open up. Nancy responded with one-word answers or vague statements, her attention focused on her phone. Rebecca, exhausted from travel and discouraged by Nancy's lack of engagement, eventually gave up and spent the remainder of the flight reading work documents and trying not to think about how much she had spent on a trip that already felt like a failure. They arrived at the St. Regis Bali Resort on the afternoon of August 4th, jet-lagged and tired. The resort was everything Rebecca had hoped it would be, luxurious, serene, with stunning views of the ocean and impeccable service. Their room was spacious, with 2 queen-sized beds, a sitting area, and a balcony overlooking the beach. Rebecca hoped that the beauty of the surroundings might soften Nancy's mood, might create space for the kind of conversations they hadn't been able to have at home. For the first 2 days, things seemed almost normal. On August 5th, they spent the morning by the pool, had lunch at one of the resort's restaurants, and walked along the beach in the late afternoon. Rebecca took photos of Nancy smiling against the backdrop of the ocean, photos she later posted to Facebook with a caption that read, "So grateful for this time with my beautiful daughter." Friends and family back home commented on the photos, saying how happy they both looked, how wonderful it was that they were spending quality time together. But beneath the surface, the tension remained. Nancy was in frequent contact with Ray, who had arrived in Bali that same day and was staying at a hotel less than 2 miles away. She met him twice during the first 2 days, slipping away while Rebecca napped or was in the shower, telling her mother she was going for a walk or to explore the resort. During these meetings, Nancy and Ray finalized their plan. They discussed the layout of the hotel room, the best time to act, and how they would dispose of the evidence afterward. Ray had brought with him a large hunting knife, a tool he claimed he had purchased for camping, but which was clearly designed for more brutal purposes. The knife had a 10-inch blade, serrated on one side and razor-sharp on the other, capable of cutting through bone and cartilage with minimal effort. He kept it hidden in his luggage, wrapped in a towel to avoid detection during airport security screening. Nancy, meanwhile, had brought an extra-large suitcase, telling her mother she needed space for souvenirs and gifts for friends. The suitcase was empty except for a few items of clothing, but it was sturdy and lockable, designed to hold a significant amount of weight. On the evening of August 6th, Rebecca suggested they have dinner at one of the resort's fine dining restaurants, a place called Kayu Putih that specialized in fresh seafood and had received excellent reviews. Nancy agreed, and they spent 2 hours at the restaurant, eating slowly and talking more openly than they had in months. Rebecca, feeling a flicker of hope, asked Nancy about her interests, her friends, what she wanted to do after high school. Nancy, perhaps feeling guilty about what she was planning, engaged more than she had previously, sharing stories about school and even laughing at a joke Rebecca made. For a brief moment, it felt like the trip was working, like they were finally beginning to reconnect. But later that night, back in the hotel room, Nancy sent Ray a message. "Tomorrow night, be ready." August 7th began like the previous days. Rebecca and Nancy had breakfast at the resort, spent time at the beach, and explored a nearby market where Rebecca purchased a handmade sarong and Nancy bought a bracelet. But in the late afternoon, Rebecca received a notification on her phone. An unfamiliar charge on her credit card for $500 transferred to an account she didn't recognize. She stared at the screen, her stomach sinking, and immediately suspected Nancy was involved. She waited until they were back in the room to confront her, hoping to have the conversation privately rather than in public. "Nancy," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I just saw a charge on my credit card that I didn't make. Do you know anything about it?" Nancy looked up from her phone, her expression carefully neutral. "No," she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Rebecca's frustration flared. "Nancy, I'm not stupid. This is a transfer to an account I've never seen before. If you used my card, I need you to tell me right now." Nancy's face flushed. "Why do you always assume it's me? Maybe your card got hacked. Did you think of that?" Rebecca pressed harder. "The charge was made yesterday while we were here. So unless someone broke into our room and used my card without me noticing, I think you know exactly what happened." Nancy stood abruptly, her voice rising. "You don't know anything about me, Mom. You never have. Why does it even matter? You have plenty of money." Rebecca, her voice shaking now, said, "It matters because you're lying to me. It matters because I brought you here to try to fix things between us, and you're stealing from me." Nancy grabbed her phone and stormed toward the bathroom. "I'm not dealing with this," she yelled. "You don't care about me. You never have." She slammed the bathroom door and locked it. Rebecca stood in the middle of the room, her hands trembling, unsure what to do next. She could hear Nancy moving around in the bathroom, the faint sound of typing, the occasional muffled word. She considered calling Andrew, asking him to talk to Nancy, but she didn't want to admit that the trip had been a failure. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited, hoping Nancy would calm down and come out so they could talk. But Nancy didn't come out for over an hour, and when she finally did, her face was set in a hard, unreadable expression. She said nothing to Rebecca, climbed into her bed and turned off the light. Rebecca, exhausted and emotionally drained, did the same. What Rebecca didn't know was that during that hour in the bathroom, Nancy had been in constant communication with Ray. The messages were brief and urgent. "She knows about the money," Nancy wrote. Ray responded, "What do you want to do?" Nancy's reply came quickly, "We do it tonight. I'll leave the door unlocked." Ray sent one final message, "I'm ready. Just tell me when." Nancy waited until she was certain Rebecca was asleep, then sent the final message just after midnight. "Do it now." Ray Jackson entered the St. Regis Bali Resort at 12:47 a.m. on August 8, 2014. Security footage later recovered by investigators showed him walking through the lobby, head down, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, moving with purpose but not urgency. He bypassed the front desk, which was staffed by a single night clerk who was focused on paperwork, and took the elevator to the 4th floor where Rebecca and Nancy's room was located. He approached room 412 and found the door unlocked, just as Nancy had promised. He slipped inside without knocking. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of a bedside lamp Nancy had left on. Rebecca was asleep in the bed closest to the window, her back to the door, her breathing slow and regular. Nancy was sitting in a chair near the bathroom, her phone in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door as Ray entered. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched as Ray crossed the room. He moved quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and pulled the hunting knife from beneath his jacket. The weapon was large, intimidating, designed for cutting through tough material. He approached the bed, his heart pounding, his hands steady despite the enormity of what he was about to do. In one swift motion, he struck Rebecca in the neck, the blade slicing through skin, muscle, and artery with brutal efficiency. Rebecca woke in the instant of impact, her eyes flying open, her hands reaching instinctively toward the wound. Blood poured from the cut, soaking the sheets and the front of her nightgown. She tried to call out, but the sound was garbled, choked, barely audible. She turned her head toward Nancy, her eyes wide with shock and confusion, and saw her daughter sitting motionless across the room. Rebecca's mouth moved as if to form words, but no words came. Her hands fell away from her neck, her body convulsing once, twice, and then going still. The entire attack lasted less than 30 seconds. Ray stepped back from the bed, breathing heavily, the knife still in his hand, blood dripping from the blade onto the carpet. He looked at Nancy. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nancy stood, pocketing her phone. Her face was pale but composed, her voice steady. "We clean up," she said, "and we leave." What followed was a methodical, calculated effort to conceal the crime and dispose of the evidence. Ray and Nancy worked together with chilling efficiency, moving Rebecca's body from the bed to the bathroom where they could better control the mess. They stripped the bloodied sheets and towels and used additional towels to absorb as much blood as possible. Nancy had thought ahead, bringing plastic garbage bags that she now used to contain the soiled linens. Ray began the process of dismembering Rebecca's body, using the same knife he had used to kill her working in the bathroom, while Nancy remained in the main room pacing, checking her phone, occasionally glancing toward the bathroom door. The process took over 2 hours, and by 3:30 a.m., Rebecca's remains had been wrapped tightly in plastic and placed inside the extra-large suitcase Nancy had brought specifically for this purpose. They cleaned the bathroom as thoroughly as possible, wiping down surfaces, rinsing the drain, and using bleach Nancy had purchased from a local store the day before. They replaced the sheets on Rebecca's bed with a fresh set from the closet, rearranged the furniture to cover any remaining stains on the carpet, and disposed of the bloodied towels and linens in multiple garbage bags they planned to discard separately. By 5 a.m., the room looked relatively normal, though a faint metallic smell still lingered in the air. Ray left the hotel separately, taking a taxi back to his own accommodation to retrieve his belongings. Nancy showered, dressed, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the suitcase that now held her mother's body. She felt numb, disconnected, as though the events of the past few hours had happened to someone else. She checked her phone, scrolling through social media, seeing the photos she had posted just days earlier of her and her mother smiling on the beach. The comments were still coming in, friends saying how happy they looked, how much fun they seemed to be having. Nancy closed the app and lay down, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. At 6:30 a.m., she called the front desk to request an early checkout, claiming a family emergency required them to return to the United States immediately. The receptionist, a young woman named Anna Dewey, noted the request and asked if everything was all right. Nancy's voice was calm, rehearsed. "My grandmother is very sick," she said. "We need to get home as soon as possible." Anna expressed sympathy and said she would prepare the checkout paperwork. Nancy thanked her and hung up. An hour later, Ray returned to the resort, and together they carried the luggage down to the lobby. The suitcase containing Rebecca's body was heavy, requiring both of them to maneuver it onto the luggage cart. They moved slowly, carefully, avoiding sudden movements that might draw attention. When they arrived at the front desk, Anna processed the checkout with professional efficiency. She noted that Rebecca Cooper, listed as the primary guest on the reservation, was not present and asked if Ms. Cooper would be joining them. Nancy, without hesitation, said that her mother was already at the airport, having left early to handle the flight arrangements. Anna accepted this explanation, though something about the situation felt off to her. The early checkout, the absence of the primary guest, the faint smell that seemed to cling to the luggage, it all added up to a vague sense of unease. She processed the paperwork and was about to wish them a safe journey when hotel policy kicked in. The St. Regis had recently implemented stricter security measures following a series of thefts from guest rooms, and staff had been instructed to conduct random luggage inspections when anything seemed out of the ordinary. Anna made the decision to follow protocol. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice polite but firm. "Hotel policy requires us to conduct a brief security inspection of your luggage before you leave the property. It will only take a moment." Nancy's face tightened almost imperceptibly, but she nodded. "Of course," she said, "whatever you need to do." Anna called for security, and within minutes, a guard named Ketut Surya arrived at the desk. He was a middle-aged man who had worked at the resort for over a decade and had conducted hundreds of luggage inspections. He approached the task with routine professionalism, opening the first suitcase without incident. It contained clothing, toiletries, books, the typical contents of a vacation bag. But when he unzipped the second suitcase, the larger one Nancy had been guarding closely, the smell intensified immediately. Ketut's expression shifted from routine professionalism to alarm. He peeled back the top layer of fabric and saw what lay beneath: plastic wrap, blood-stained towels, and the unmistakable shape of human remains. He stepped back, his hand over his mouth, and looked at Anna. "Call the police," he said quietly but urgently. "Right now." Anna's face went pale. She picked up the phone with shaking hands and dialed the local police station. Nancy and Ray stood frozen at the desk, their faces carefully blank but their bodies tense. Within minutes, officers from the Denpasar Police Department arrived at the hotel, securing the area and taking both suspects into custody. The suitcase was transported to a nearby facility for forensic examination, and the hotel room was sealed as a crime scene. Investigators arrived shortly after, led by Detective Maid Sutama, a 20-year veteran of the Denpasar police force who specialized in violent crimes. Detective Sutama had seen many things during his career, but the brutality and premeditation of this case stood out even to him. He directed his team to process the room thoroughly, photographing every surface, collecting trace evidence, and documenting the crime scene with meticulous care. What they found confirmed the worst. Despite Nancy and Ray's efforts to clean up, blood spatter was still visible on the walls of the bathroom, particularly in the corners where the walls met the ceiling. Trace evidence in the drain showed residue consistent with human blood and tissue. Fibers collected from the bathroom floor matched the sheets that had been discarded in the garbage bags, and the carpet near Rebecca's bed, though scrubbed, still showed faint staining that luminol testing revealed to be blood. The forensic examination of the suitcase and its contents provided even more damning evidence. Rebecca's body had been dismembered into multiple pieces, wrapped tightly in plastic, and packed in layers of towels and clothing to mask the smell. The cuts were precise, suggesting the use of a sharp blade and some level of anatomical knowledge, or at least careful planning. The knife used in the attack was not immediately recovered, but investigators suspected it was still in Ray's possession. Nancy and Ray were separated and questioned independently. Nancy was taken to a small interrogation room at the Denpasar police station, where she was read her rights through a translator and informed that she was being held on suspicion of murder. She remained silent for the first hour, staring at the table in front of her, refusing to make eye contact with the officers. When Detective Sutama entered the room, he adopted a calm, conversational tone, hoping to encourage Nancy to open up. "Nancy," he said, "I know this is difficult, but we need to understand what happened. Your mother is dead, and we need to know why." Nancy looked up, her expression unreadable. "I want a lawyer," she said. Detective Sutama nodded. "That's your right," he said. "But before we bring in a lawyer, I want you to understand the situation you're in. We have evidence that places you at the scene. We have your luggage, your phone, your mother's body. We know you and Ray were involved. The only question now is why." Nancy said nothing, and after a few more attempts to engage her, Detective Sutama left the room. Meanwhile, Ray was being questioned in a separate room by Detective Wayan Aditya, a younger officer known for his ability to build rapport with suspects. Ray was more talkative than Nancy, though his initial statements were evasive. He claimed he had come to Bali to surprise Nancy, that he had no idea what she was planning, that he had been horrified when he realized what had happened. "I didn't want to do it," he said, his voice shaking. "She made me. She said if I didn't help her, she'd tell the police I was involved anyway. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Detective Aditya listened patiently, taking notes, but he could tell Ray's story didn't add up. If Ray had truly been coerced, why had he brought a hunting knife with him to Bali? Why had he entered the hotel room in the middle of the night? Why had he participated in dismembering and concealing the body? The detective pressed harder, pointing out the inconsistencies in Ray's account, and gradually Ray's story began to change. He admitted that he and Nancy had discussed the trip beforehand, that they had talked about getting rid of Rebecca, though he claimed he hadn't believed Nancy was serious. He admitted that he had brought the knife but said it was for self-defense, not for attacking Rebecca. He admitted that he had been in the hotel room when Rebecca was killed, but insisted that Nancy had been the one to plan everything, that he had simply followed her instructions. The breakthrough came when investigators seized Ray and Nancy's phones. Forensic analysts worked through the night to recover deleted messages, search history, and location data. What they found was a digital trail that told the entire story. Text messages between Nancy and Ray dating back to mid-July showed clear evidence of planning. Nancy had discussed the trip to Bali, the layout of the hotel, the best time to act, and how they would dispose of the body. Ray had expressed doubts at times, but had ultimately agreed to participate. The messages also revealed Nancy's motive, or at least the justification she had constructed in her mind. "She ruined everything," Nancy had written in one message. "She drove Dad away. She never cared about me. She deserves this." Ray's responses were more ambiguous, sometimes supportive, sometimes cautious, but never outright refusing. In addition to the text messages, investigators found search history on Nancy's phone that painted a chilling picture of premeditation. In the weeks leading up to the trip, Nancy had searched for information on how long it takes for a body to decompose in tropical climates, whether hotel security cameras record continuously, the extradition policies between Indonesia and the United States, and the best methods for cleaning blood from fabric and carpet. She had also searched for information on how to use a hunting knife, suggesting that she had been involved in planning the method of attack as well as the cover-up. Armed with this evidence, Detective Sutama returned to the interrogation room where Nancy was being held. He placed printouts of the text messages on the table in front of her and waited for her reaction. Nancy stared at the pages, her face draining of color, and for the first time her composure cracked. "Where did you get these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "From your phone," Detective Sutama said. "We have everything, Nancy. We know you planned this. We know you and Ray coordinated every detail. We know you unlocked the door, sent him the message to come to the room, and helped him dispose of your mother's body. There's no point in denying it anymore." Nancy looked at the detective, her eyes filling with tears, but she said nothing. After a long silence, she asked again for a lawyer, and the interrogation ended. The case presented significant jurisdictional challenges that would take weeks to resolve. Both Nancy and Ray were United States citizens, and the crime had occurred on Indonesian soil. Under Indonesian law, they could be tried and sentenced in Indonesia, where murder convictions can carry the death penalty. However, the United States government, informed of the arrests through diplomatic channels, requested extradition, arguing that the victim's family had the right to see justice served in their home country, and that the suspects, as American citizens, should be tried under American law. The Indonesian government, while sympathetic to the request, was initially reluctant to agree. The crime had occurred in their jurisdiction, and there was a strong legal argument for handling the case domestically. However, diplomatic pressure from the U.S. State Department, combined with concerns about the international attention the case was receiving, eventually led to a decision to honor the extradition request. On September 20, 2014, after nearly 6 weeks of legal negotiations, Indonesian authorities agreed to extradite Nancy and Ray to the United States, provided that American prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty, a condition the U.S. government accepted. During the weeks they spent in Indonesian custody, both Nancy and Ray were held in separate facilities in Denpasar. Nancy was housed in a women's detention center, where she was kept in isolation for her own safety, as news of the crime had spread and other inmates were reportedly hostile toward her. Ray was held in a men's facility under similar conditions. Neither of them received visitors, though both were assigned legal counsel through the American consulate. The extradition process required extensive paperwork, coordination between multiple government agencies, and the preparation of evidence that would be admissible in American courts. Indonesian forensic experts worked closely with their American counterparts to ensure that all physical evidence, DNA samples, blood spatter patterns, digital data, was properly documented and preserved for use in the upcoming trial. On October 15, 2014, Nancy and Ray were transported under heavy security from Denpasar to Jakarta, where they boarded a commercial flight to Los Angeles, accompanied by U.S. Marshals. From Los Angeles, they were flown to Portland, Oregon, and transferred to separate detention facilities to await trial. The media coverage of their return was extensive, with news outlets across the country reporting on the case and speculating about the motives behind such a brutal crime. Rebecca's family, meanwhile, was struggling to come to terms with the loss. Her parents, David and Linda Cooper, now in their early 70s, had been notified of Rebecca's death shortly after her body was discovered. The news had been delivered by 2 detectives from the Eugene Police Department who had traveled to their home in Portland to inform them in person. Linda collapsed upon hearing the news, and David, though outwardly composed, was visibly shaken. In the days that followed, they learned the full details of how Rebecca had died and who was responsible. The revelation that their granddaughter had been involved was almost too much to bear. "We thought we knew Nancy," Linda said in a statement released through the family's attorney. "We thought she was a troubled teenager, yes, but not capable of something like this. We don't understand how this happened. We don't understand how she could do this to her own mother." Andrew Cooper, Rebecca's ex-husband and Nancy's father, was equally devastated. He had been contacted by police the day after Nancy's arrest and had flown to Bali in a desperate attempt to see his daughter, but Indonesian authorities had denied his request, citing the ongoing investigation. When he learned the details of the crime, he was overwhelmed with guilt, wondering if there was something he could have done to prevent it, some sign he had missed. In a brief statement released through his attorney after the extradition, Andrew said, "Rebecca and I had our differences, but she was a good person who loved her daughter. I don't understand how Nancy could have done this. I don't recognize the person she has become. I am heartbroken for Rebecca's family, and I am heartbroken for my daughter who has destroyed her own life." The trial began on March 9, 2015, in the United States District Court for the District of Oregon. The case had been assigned to Judge Margaret Holloway, a federal judge with over 20 years of experience presiding over complex criminal cases. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Morse, a seasoned prosecutor known for his methodical approach and his ability to present complex evidence in a way that juries could easily understand. The defense team for Nancy consisted of 2 public defenders, Sarah Lynn and Michael Torres, both experienced in capital cases. Ray's defense was handled by private attorney Robert Klein, whom Ray's family had hired, using funds raised through a crowdfunding campaign. The trial attracted significant media attention, with reporters from across the country filling the courtroom and providing daily updates on the proceedings. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: forensic evidence, digital evidence, and witness testimony. Assistant U.S. Attorney Morse began his opening statement by painting a picture of a young woman consumed by resentment and willing to commit murder to escape her mother's influence. "This is not a case of a troubled teenager acting on impulse," he said. "This is a case of premeditated murder, planned over weeks, coordinated down to the smallest detail, and executed with chilling precision. Nancy Cooper did not snap. She plotted, she schemed, she manipulated, and she killed her own mother in cold blood." The forensic evidence was presented first. Dr. Emily Harrison, a forensic pathologist who had examined Rebecca's remains, testified about the nature of the injuries and the cause of death. She explained that Rebecca had died from blood loss due to a deep laceration to the neck that had severed both the carotid artery and the jugular vein. The cut was consistent with a single forceful strike from a sharp blade, and the angle of the wound suggested that the attacker had been standing to the side and slightly behind the victim. Dr. Harrison also testified about the dismemberment, noting that the cuts were relatively clean and appeared to have been made with a large, sharp knife. She said that the person who performed the dismemberment likely had some familiarity with cutting through tissue and bone, though not necessarily formal training. On cross-examination, the defense attempted to suggest that the dismemberment could have been done by Ray alone, without Nancy's involvement, but Dr. Harrison pointed out that the logistics of moving and positioning the body would have required at least 2 people. Next, the prosecution presented DNA evidence. Forensic analyst Dr. James Chen testified that DNA samples collected from the crime scene matched both Nancy and Ray. Nancy's DNA was found on the handle of the suitcase, on towels used to wrap the body, and on the door handle of the hotel room. Ray's DNA was found on the knife used in the attack, on Rebecca's clothing, and on plastic wrap used to contain the remains. Dr. Chen explained that the DNA evidence placed both defendants at the scene and directly connected them to the murder and the subsequent cover-up. The digital evidence was perhaps the most damning. FBI Special Agent Laura Martinez, a specialist in digital forensics, walked the jury through the contents of Nancy and Ray's phones. She presented a timeline of text messages that showed the evolution of the plan, starting with vague references in mid-July and escalating to explicit coordination in the days leading up to the murder. She highlighted key messages, including Nancy's text on the night of the murder. "Do it now." Agent Martinez also presented search history from Nancy's phone, showing her queries about body decomposition, hotel security, and extradition policies. "This search history shows a clear pattern of research and planning," she testified. Nancy Cooper was not acting on impulse. She was preparing for a specific outcome. The defense objected multiple times during Agent Martinez's testimony, arguing that search history alone did not prove intent and that many people conduct morbid internet searches out of curiosity without ever committing crimes. Judge Holloway overruled most of the objections, allowing the evidence to be presented, but instructing the jury to consider it in the context of all the other evidence. Witness testimony provided additional context. Several of Nancy's former classmates and teachers testified about her behavior in the months leading up to the trip, describing her as increasingly withdrawn, defiant, and angry. One teacher, Ms. Patricia Reynolds, testified that Nancy had written an essay for an English class in which she described feeling trapped by her mother's expectations and fantasizing about running away. "I was concerned enough to refer her to the school counselor," Ms. Reynolds said. "But Nancy refused to attend the sessions, and there was only so much we could do." Friends of Ray testified about his relationship with Nancy, describing him as manipulative and controlling. One friend, Marcus Thompson, testified that Ray had told him he was planning to do something big in the summer of 2014, but had been vague about the details. "I thought he was talking about a job or maybe moving away," Marcus said. "I never imagined he meant something like this." The defense's strategy was to portray Nancy as a victim of psychological abuse and Ray as a manipulative older man who had exploited her vulnerability. Nancy's lead attorney, Sarah Lynn, presented an expert witness, Dr. Robert Feldman, a psychologist who specialized in adolescent trauma. Dr. Feldman testified that Nancy exhibited signs of complex post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from what he described as years of emotional neglect and psychological pressure from her mother. Nancy grew up in an environment where her emotional needs were consistently unmet, Dr. Feldman testified. Her mother, while financially providing for the family, was emotionally absent. This created a profound sense of abandonment and resentment in Nancy, which was exacerbated by the divorce and the introduction of Ray into her life. Dr. Feldman argued that Nancy's involvement in the murder was the result of severe psychological distress rather than calculated malice. He suggested that Ray had manipulated her, taking advantage of her emotional vulnerability and convincing her that violence was the only solution to her problems. On cross-examination, Assistant U.S. Attorney Morse challenged Dr. Feldman's conclusions. "Dr. Feldman, you've testified that Nancy was emotionally neglected," Morse said. "But isn't it also true that her mother worked hard to provide for her, that she paid for private school, that she took her on an expensive vacation to try to repair their relationship?" Dr. Feldman conceded that Rebecca had made efforts, but argued that material provision was not the same as emotional support. Morse pressed further. "And isn't it also true, Dr. Feldman, that Nancy conducted internet searches about how to cover up a murder, that she coordinated Ray's arrival in Bali, that she sent him the message to enter the hotel room? Do those actions sound like someone acting out of desperation or someone planning a crime?" Dr. Feldman acknowledged that the planning was inconsistent with impulsive behavior, but maintained that Nancy's psychological state made her susceptible to manipulation. Ray's defense attorney, Robert Klein, took a different approach, arguing that Ray had been coerced by Nancy into participating in the crime. Klein presented testimony from Ray himself, who took the stand in his own defense. Ray testified that he had been in a relationship with Nancy and that she had repeatedly talked about how much she hated her mother and wished she were dead. "At first, I thought it was just venting," Ray said. "Teenagers say stuff like that all the time. But as the trip got closer, she started talking about it more seriously. She said she wanted to kill her mother, and she wanted me to help her. I told her I didn't want to, but she said if I didn't, she'd tell the police I was planning to hurt her, that I'd go to jail. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. Ray's testimony was emotional at times, with him breaking down in tears as he described the night of the murder. I never wanted to hurt anyone, he said. I just wanted Nancy to be happy. I thought if I helped her, she'd be free, and we could be together. I know it was wrong, I know I should have said no. But I didn't, and now Rebecca is dead, and I have to live with that. On cross-examination, Assistant U.S. Attorney Morse dismantled Ray's claims of coercion. He presented evidence showing that Ray had purchased the hunting knife weeks before the trip, that he had researched flights to Bali on his own, and that he had sent messages to Nancy expressing eagerness to get it done. Mr. Jackson, you testified that you were coerced, Morse said. But isn't it true that you brought a weapon specifically designed to kill? Isn't it true that you entered that hotel room willingly? Isn't it true that you struck Rebecca Cooper with that knife not once, but with enough force to sever major arteries? Ray struggled to respond, his earlier composure evaporating. I didn't think it through, he stammered. I was just doing what Nancy wanted. Morse pressed on. And when you dismembered her body, were you doing what Nancy wanted then too? Or were you trying to cover up your own crime? Ray didn't answer, and Morse concluded his cross-examination. The closing arguments took place over 2 days. Assistant U.S. Attorney Morse summarized the evidence, emphasizing the premeditation, the coordination, and the utter lack of remorse shown by both defendants. Nancy Cooper and Ryan Jackson planned this murder for weeks, he said. They coordinated every detail. They traveled to a foreign country specifically to commit this crime, believing that distance and international jurisdiction would protect them. They were wrong. Justice does not have borders, and these defendants will be held accountable for what they have done. Sarah Lynn, in her closing argument for Nancy, appealed to the jury's empathy. Nancy Cooper is not a monster, she said. She is a young woman who was failed by the people who were supposed to protect her. Her mother, though well-intentioned, was emotionally absent. Her father, though loving, could not shield her from the pain of a broken home. And Ray Jackson, a manipulative older man, took advantage of her vulnerability and convinced her that violence was the only way out. Nancy made a terrible mistake, one she will regret for the rest of her life. But she deserves compassion, not condemnation. Robert Klein, in his closing argument for Ray, continued to assert that his client had been coerced. Ray Jackson is not a killer, he said. He is a young man who made a series of bad decisions, influenced by a young woman who was determined to commit murder with or without his help. He should not be held to the same standard of culpability as Nancy Cooper, who was the mastermind behind this crime. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On April 28, 2015, they returned with a verdict. Both Nancy Cooper and Ryan Jackson were found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, with Rebecca's family weeping quietly in the gallery and Nancy staring straight ahead, her face expressionless. Sentencing took place on May 15, 2015. Judge Holloway delivered a lengthy statement before announcing the sentences, addressing both the heinous nature of the crime and the profound loss suffered by Rebecca's family. Rebecca Cooper was a woman who worked hard to provide for her daughter, who loved her despite the difficulties in their relationship, and who sought to repair that relationship through a gesture of goodwill, Judge Holloway said. She was betrayed in the most unimaginable way, murdered by her own child and a young man who should have known better. This court cannot bring Rebecca back, but it can ensure that justice is served. Nancy Cooper was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ryan Jackson received the same sentence. Both were remanded into custody immediately and transported to separate federal correctional facilities to begin serving their sentences. Rebecca's body was returned to the United States in late August 2014, shortly after the initial investigation in Bali concluded. She was buried on September 7, 2014, in a private ceremony at Riverview Cemetery in Portland, Oregon, attended by close family and friends. The service was small and somber, with eulogies delivered by her parents, her brother Michael, and several colleagues from Pacific Northwest Capital Management. Andrew Cooper attended but did not speak, sitting quietly in the back row with his head bowed. Rebecca's grave is marked with a simple granite headstone that bears her name, the years of her life, 1972 to 2014, and an inscription chosen by her parents. She loved deeply and worked tirelessly. She deserved better. In the years since the trial, Nancy and Ray have both remained incarcerated. Nancy is housed at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, a medium-security women's prison. According to records, she has declined most requests for interviews and has limited contact with the outside world. She has taken some college courses through a prison education program and works in the prison library, but she has not expressed public remorse for her actions. Ray is serving his sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Victorville, California, a high-security men's facility. He has reportedly had disciplinary issues related to altercations with other inmates and has spent time in solitary confinement. Like Nancy, he has not expressed public remorse, though he did file an appeal in 2017 arguing that his sentence was excessive, given his claim of coercion. The appeal was denied. The case has been examined in multiple true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books, each attempting to understand the psychological dynamics that led to such a horrific outcome. Criminologists who have studied the case point to several contributing factors. The long-standing resentment Nancy felt toward her mother, exacerbated by the divorce, and the perception that Rebecca had prioritized career over family. The influence of Ray Jackson as an enabler, who validated Nancy's anger and provided the means to act on it, and the lack of effective intervention by teachers, counselors, or family members who might have recognized the warning signs and provided support before the situation escalated to violence. Some experts have also noted the role of digital communication in facilitating the crime, as Nancy and Ray were able to coordinate their actions in real time and with a level of detail that would have been more difficult in an earlier era. For Rebecca's family, the loss remains a source of profound grief. Her parents, David and Linda Cooper, now in their late 70s, have spoken occasionally to the media about their daughter, always emphasizing her dedication to her work and her love for Nancy despite the challenges. Rebecca was not perfect, Linda said in a 2017 interview. She made mistakes as a parent, as we all do, but she loved Nancy with all her heart, and she was trying so hard to fix what was broken between them. She didn't deserve what happened to her, no one does. David, in the same interview, expressed his continued struggle to understand how Nancy could have committed such an act. "I keep asking myself if there was something we could have done, some sign we missed," he said. "But the truth is, we didn't know. We thought Nancy was just going through a difficult phase. We never imagined she was capable of something like this." Andrew Cooper has remained largely out of the public eye since the trial. In a brief statement released through his attorney in 2016, he said, "I think about Rebecca every day. I think about the life she had, the potential she had, and how it was all taken away. I also think about Nancy, and I wonder where I went wrong as a father. I don't have answers. I only have questions and a grief that will never go away." He has not visited Nancy in prison and has stated publicly that he does not plan to do so. The broader impact of the case has been felt in discussions about family dynamics, adolescent mental health, and the warning signs of violent behavior. Some advocates have used the case to call for better mental health resources in schools, arguing that early intervention might have prevented the tragedy. Others have pointed to the case as an example of how parental absence, even when motivated by the desire to provide financially, can have devastating emotional consequences for children. There has also been debate about the role of the criminal justice system in cases involving young offenders. Some legal scholars have argued that sentencing a 15-year-old to life without parole is excessively harsh, particularly given the growing body of research showing that adolescent brains are not fully developed and that young people are more susceptible to peer influence and impulsive decision-making. Others have countered that the level of premeditation involved in Nancy's crime demonstrates a capacity for moral reasoning, and that the severity of the sentence is appropriate given the brutality of the murder and the profound loss suffered by the victim's family. The case also raised questions about international jurisdiction and the challenges of prosecuting crimes that occur in foreign countries. The decision to extradite Nancy and Ray to the United States while ultimately successful, required months of diplomatic negotiation and highlighted the complexities of navigating different legal systems with different standards for evidence, trial procedures, and sentencing. Some legal experts have used the case as a teaching tool for discussing the principles of international criminal law and the mechanisms by which countries cooperate to ensure that justice is served regardless of where a crime occurs. In 2018, a documentary titled Paradise Lost: The Murder of Rebecca Cooper was released on a major streaming platform, providing a comprehensive overview of the case and including interviews with investigators, forensic experts, legal analysts, and members of Rebecca's family. The documentary was widely viewed and sparked renewed interest in the case, with many viewers expressing shock at the level of planning involved and the cold-bloodedness of the crime. The documentary also included brief footage of Nancy and Ray during their trial, showing their lack of visible emotion as the verdict was read and the sentences were handed down. This footage became a focal point for discussions about remorse, accountability, and whether young offenders are capable of fully understanding the gravity of their actions. The legacy of Rebecca Cooper's murder is complex and multifaceted. It is a story of a family that fractured under pressure, of a mother who tried but could not bridge the gap with her daughter, and of a young woman whose anger turned into something deadly. It is also a story about the consequences of choices, the importance of intervention, and the enduring power of resentment when left unchecked. For those who knew Rebecca, she is remembered as a dedicated professional, a loving mother who made mistakes, but always tried to do better, and a woman whose life was cut tragically short. For those who study the case, it serves as a reminder that behind every headline there are real people, real relationships, and real grief that does not fade with time. This is the story of Rebecca and Nancy Cooper, a bond that should have been unbreakable, but was instead shattered beyond repair, leaving in its wake a mother buried too soon, a daughter who will spend the rest of her life behind bars, and a family forever haunted by the question of what might have been if anger had been met with understanding, if distance had been met with presence, and if the trip to Bali had truly been a chance to heal rather than a stage for betrayal. The questions linger, as they always do in cases like this. Could this have been prevented? Were there missed opportunities for intervention? And what does it say about our society that a 15-year-old girl could plan and execute the murder of her own mother with such cold precision? These are questions without easy answers, questions that will continue to be debated by psychologists, criminologists, legal scholars, and anyone who encounters this chilling, true story. What remains undeniable is the loss of Rebecca Cooper, the loss of a mother-daughter relationship, and the loss of potential for two young people whose lives are now defined by a crime so horrific it defies comprehension.